Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe not for as many years as Senator Kim, but I too have the diversity of experience, having started in local government, a member of the Los Angeles City Council once upon a time, having served a couple terms in the California legislature before coming to the Senate. So I've seen the challenges of creating additional housing, whether it's the need for additional affordable housing, the housing affordability crisis, through multiple angles. And so, yes, our housing crisis is primarily a crisis of supply at this point. Haven't been intimately familiar with negotiating deals and seeing successful developments and those that were great visions but failed to come to fruition. It's because of oftentimes the bottlenecks or the bureaucracy and the well-intentioned measures to regulate housing production have also at times become a barrier to increasing the housing supply that a growing population needs. Typically, a developer must first secure a site before pursuing subsidies in the forms of grants or loans from multiple sources to amass the capital necessary before then applying for tax credits, if that's what it takes to get a project to pencil. Clearly, that can take a long time, often years and years and years. This has essentially also shut out small-scale developers who lack the financial resources or expertise to navigate government bureaucracy, and has increasingly driven builders to turn to the private sector for capital to fund permanent and affordable housing units. But most of us agree housing is a human right, and private investment alone cannot be the solution to the housing crisis. We must provide additional funding to improve the efficiency of the traditional affordable housing development process in order to increase the pace of housing production to keep up with the need that's clearly out there. Question for both Ms. Bailey and Ms. Ventura. How could we streamline federal programs so that developers can more easily navigate and maximize available public funds?
Thank you, Senator, for this question. First, what I think is critically important is to think about the HUD programs that have been put together to invest in capital resources. Those programs were developed independent of each other and not designed to be able to necessarily work together. So they're critically important, but they also haven't been reauthorized in quite some time. So looking at those programs collectively so that we can streamline them, make them easier to work together, and do exactly as you suggest, close those gaps, because in development, time is money.
Ms. Ventura, same question.
Thank you. I would certainly echo what Ms. Bailey had to say, Senator. I think that it's like a jigsaw puzzle when you try to put these transactions together. They are complicated and they're difficult, and very often we will provide technical assistance to help developers get through that process, but certainly agreeing that streamlining process on a federal level, aligning the programs better, would certainly help expedite the process.
Thank you. Look forward to working with both of you to pursue that, recognizing that, first of all, we need the input from the folks who practice this, to develop in community, but also recognizing that what it takes to build in Los Angeles is going to be different than what it is to build in Bakersfield, California, which is going to be different than Texas versus New York versus Montana, et cetera. Want to make sure in my time remaining to touch on one other area, and that's homelessness and the lack of affordable housing are not new issues, but clearly unacceptable that more than 650,000 people, I'm talking veterans, families, young people, seniors, experience homelessness on any given night in the United States each and every year. And even more Americans experience housing insecurity. So they may not be experiencing homelessness yet, but one small stroke of bad luck, and they may very well find themselves in that situation, which is why I was proud to introduce my Housing for All Act, which would strategically surge federal investments in existing programs to reduce housing insecurity and increase funding for innovative, locally developed solutions. As Senator Kane said, if we have successful programs, don't need additional programs to compete with them. Let's just amplify, let's scale up. And homelessness is not just an urban or just a rural issue. It's not just a red state or just a blue state issue. It affects all states, all counties, all communities. Ms. Bailey, what innovative solutions could the federal government invest in to keep more people housed and prevent more Americans from falling into homelessness?
So the pandemic actually showed us the way in this space. With the Emergency Housing Voucher Program, HUD was given additional flexibility to alter how the voucher program worked and gave housing authorities additional resources to provide the services and be able to lease up a population that we generally consider among the hardest to serve, folks who have been experiencing homelessness. And housing authorities were able to do that in record time. This has been one of the more successful programs we've had in being able to take a resource from Congress and house folks quickly. The other thing I would say is experimentation in how to streamline the voucher program would be really critical. And one idea is to provide direct rental assistance to tenants. Right now, rental assistance goes to the landlord. If we could provide rental assistance that looks more like cash from the landlord's perspective, it could get rid of some of the source of income discrimination and streamline the process so that renters would be able to use the dollars more flexibly.
Right. My time is up, but I just call my colleagues' attention to not just helping address housing affordability in the short term, but you can appreciate the ripple effects in terms of greater economic benefit for local communities, for the state, and for the nation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next up, Senator Braun.
Ask questions yet in 7-minute rounds. And we'll turn first to Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Colleagues, as we reconvene, I'm proud once again to share that I am one of the few senators with younger children. And I lead with that because as we are having this conversation today, it's not lost on me that between my children, who are all now in the teen and preteen category, and their friends, I see this issue very up close and personal. And in that spirit, I want to take a second to just acknowledge and thank all the parents who are in the audience today, many of whom have shared their stories with our offices, and I credit them for finding strength through their suffering, through their struggle, and channeling that into the advocacy that is making a difference. I thank all of you. Now, I appreciate, again, personally, the challenges that parents and caretakers, school personnel, and others face in helping our young people navigate this world of social media and technology in general. Now, the services our children are growing up with provide them unrivaled access to information. I mean, this is beyond what previous generations have experienced. And that includes learning opportunities, socialization, and much, much more. But we also clearly have a lot of work to do to better protect our children from the predators and predatory behavior that these technologies have enabled. And yes, Mr. Zuckerberg, that includes exacerbating the mental health crisis in America. Nearly all teens, we know, have access to smartphones and the internet and use the internet daily. And while guardians do have primary responsibility for caring for our children, the old adage says it takes a village. And so society as a whole, including leaders in the tech industry, must prioritize the health and safety of our children. Now, dive into my questions now and be specific, platform by platform, witness by witness, on the topic of some of the parental tools you have each made reference to. Mr. Citron, how many minors are on Discord, and how many of them have caretakers that have adopted your Family Center tool? And if you don't have the numbers, just say that quickly and provide that to our office.
We can follow up with you on that.
How have you ensured that young people and their guardians are aware of the tools that you offer?
We make it very clear to teens on our platform what tools are available, and our Teen Safety Assist is enabled by default.
What specifically do you do? that what may be clear to you is not clear to the general public. So what do you do, in your opinion, to make it very clear?
So our Teen Safety Assist, which is a feature that helps teens keep themselves safe, in addition to blocking and blurring images that may be sent to them, that is on by default for teen accounts, and it cannot be turned off. We also have, we market and to our teen users directly on our platform. We launched our Family Center. We created a promotional video. We put it directly in our product. So when every teen opened the app, in fact, every user opened the app, they got an alert like, hey, Discord has this, they want you to use it.
Thank you. Look forward to the data that we're requesting from
we'll
Mr.
follow
Zuckerberg. Across all of Meta services, from Instagram, Facebook, Messenger, and Horizon, how many minors use your applications? And of those minors, how many have a caretaker that has adopted the parental supervision tools that you offer?
Sorry, I can follow up with the specific stats on that.
Okay, it would be very helpful, not just for us to know, but for you to know as the leader of your company. And how, same question, how are you ensuring that young people and their guardians are aware of the tools that you offer?
We run pretty extensive ad campaigns, both on our platforms and outside. We work with creators and organizations like Girl Scouts to make sure that this is broadly that there's broad awareness of the tools.
Okay. Mr. Spiegel, how many minors use Snapchat? And of those minors, how many have caretakers that are registered with your family center?
Senator, I believe approximately, in the United States, there are approximately 20 million teenage users of Snapchat. I believe approximately 200,000 parents use Family Center, and about 400,000 teens have linked their account to their parents using Family Center.
So 200,000, 400,000 sounds like a big number, but small in percentage of the minors using Snapchat. What are you doing to ensure that young people and their guardians are aware of the tools you offer?
Senator, we create a banner for Family Center on the user's profiles so that accounts we believe may be of the age that they could be parents can see the entry point into Family Center easily.
Okay. Mr. Chu, how many minors are on TikTok, and how many of them have a caregiver that uses your family tools?
Senator, I need to get back to you on the specific numbers, but we were one of the first platforms to give what we call family pairing to parents. You go to settings, you turn on the QR code, your teenager's QR code and yours, you scan it. And what it allows you to do is you can set screen time limits, you can filter out some keywords, you can turn on a more restricted mode. And we're always talking to parents. I met a group of parents and teenagers and high school teachers last week to talk about what more we can provide in the family pairing mode.
Ms. Yacarino, how many minors use X, and are you planning to implement safety measures or guidance for caretakers like your peer companies have?
Thank you, Senator. Less than 1% of all U.S. users are between the ages of 13 and 17.
Less than 1% out of how many?
Of 90 million U.S. users.
Okay, so still hundreds of thousands. Continue.
Yes, and every single one is very important. Being a 14-month-old company, we have reprioritized child protection and safety measures, and we have just begun to talk about and discuss how we can enhance those with parental controls.
Let me continue with a follow-up question for Mr. Citron. In addition to keeping parents informed about the nature of various internet services, there's a lot more we obviously need to do. For today's purposes, while many companies offer a broad range of quote-unquote user empowerment tools, it's helpful to understand whether young people even find these tools helpful. So appreciate you sharing your Teen Safety Assist and the tools and how you're advertising it, but have you conducted any assessment of how these features are impacting minors' use of your platform?
Our intention is to give teens tools, capabilities that they can use to keep themselves safe, and also so our teams can help keep teens safe. We recently launched Teen Safety Assist last year, and I do not have a study off the top of my head, but we'd be happy to follow up with you on that.
Okay. My time is up. I'll have follow-up questions for each of you, either in the second round or through statements for the record on a similar assessment of the tools that you've proposed.
Yeah, so Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Ed. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank my colleagues who have been the champions for years on this. Senators Markey, Wyden, Hirono, Welch, of course, Representatives Ocasio-Cortez, Grijalva, and all the labor leaders, all the environmental justice activists, all the youth organizers who have woken up the conscience of the nation. Now, for decades, we've talked about climate change. For too long, people felt hopeless. But today, 5 years since the introduction of the Green New Deal, it is absolutely clear that the American people can and do make a difference. A little over 5 years ago, let's remember where we were 5 years ago. We had a climate denier in the White House. We had Republican majorities in the House and the Senate. We were looking at a future that was dependent on fossil fuels and would lead nothing other than to a burning planet. But we didn't give up. In 2018, Americans stood up in overwhelming numbers and elected a Democratic majority in the House of Representatives. But we weren't done, not even close. 5 years ago, Senator Markey, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and so many of you gathered here and announced a transformative plan to save the planet. But we weren't done yet. We marched, held rallies, and in 2020, we not only held the Democratic majority in the House of Representatives, we elected a Democratic majority in the U.S. Senate and a Democratic president to the White House. But we weren't done yet. We made sure to hold the president to his word. And because of all of you and your advocacy and activism, because of the movement that you started, we enacted the largest investment in history to combat climate change. The Inflation Reduction Act, $369 billion for energy security, for environmental justice, and for climate change programs. And the goal of lowering U.S. carbon emissions by 40% by the year 2030. You did that. $4 billion to address drought in the West. You did that. U.S. emissions by 2035 will be 20% lower than they would have been without the Inflation Reduction Act. You did that. It's a hell of a start. But we still have more work to do to cut our emissions by half by the year 2035. So we can't get complacent. I know we won't get complacent. Just ask the senator from California. California's been a leader in the fight against climate change, and we still face a crisis. A year ago, I was working hard to help communities recover from 30 atmospheric rivers that hit the Golden State. And as we speak, yet another deadly storm is battering the state of California. 8 of the top 10 largest wildfires in history have ravaged California in just the last 7 years. And across the country, weather and climate disasters have cost us nearly $93 billion in damages. Meanwhile, Republican leaders threaten to roll back our progress. So no, the fight is not over yet. We haven't given up. We're not going to give up. We're going to keep working, and we're going to need your voices and your advocacy to continue so that in 5 years, we know that we'll be continuing to make a difference. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Senator Padilla. Now we're going to hear from Congressman Ro Khanna.
Is able to get here. I hear that he is on his way. It'll also be followed by opening remarks from our colleagues on the Fisheries Subcommittee. And let me turn this over to Chairman Padilla.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to my colleagues, both sides of the aisle, for participating in this joint hearing between our respective subcommittees, mine being the Senate Environment and Public Works Subcommittee on Fisheries, Water, and Wildlife. Today, we have the privilege of co-chairing this hearing, along with our Republican colleagues. It's going to be a substantive but important discussion. You see, we're teaming up to examine the issue of microplastics, including nanoplastics, in our drinking water and in wastewater. So I want to just not brag too much, but call attention to my involvement in the issue since before I even joined the Senate. In fact, I was serving as California Secretary of State in the year 2020 when I joined Senator Dan Sullivan from Alaska at a virtual event hosted by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology focused on the dangers of plastic pollution. Each of us sharing our work experience and legislative experience at that point. And as Senator Sullivan so eloquently articulated then, we knew that the issue truly can be an opportunity for bipartisan cooperation, especially as we support this emerging area of research. And while the study of microplastics is in fact still emerging, one thing we do know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is where we can find microplastics. Because the answer is everywhere. It's all around us. These tiny, sometimes microscopic shards and fragments of plastic, less than 5 millimeters in length, have been found in the clouds above our skies, in the depths of the oceans, and literally everywhere in between. Now, just last summer, here's another, I'm not trying to brag too much, but I participated in the annual Lake Tahoe Summit, the 27th annual Lake Tahoe Summit, where the governors and senators from both California and Nevada convene at the lake to talk about cooperation between our states and the federal government to protect this tremendous jewel, this tremendous natural resource. And I was reminded that even in a natural wonder like Lake Tahoe, given its high elevation, given its pristine, clear blue water, surrounded by nothing but scenic mountaintops and trees, with all the multi-state, multi-jurisdictional environmental protections, even there, microplastics is a problem. So it's no surprise that if you can find them there, then you'll find them in everyday products like plastic water bottles, with, quote, hundreds of thousands of bits of plastic per liter of water. These findings should alarm us, folks, should alarm us into action. Just how pervasive are microplastics in the water that we drink? Well, I'm proud to say that in California, we're trying to lead the way in trying to answer the question as the first government in the world to set requirements for testing microplastics in drinking water. States trying to lead the way. And this serves as a model, by the way, that other states as well as the federal government can follow in the coming years. Yet we also know that microplastics are already so common that increasingly we've found them in stomachs of sea animals, in our own food and water, and yes, even in human lungs and bloodstreams. So while we continue to learn more and more about the presence of microplastics on the planet, the question must also become, what are the potential impacts of microplastics on human health? And to explore just that, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more about the state of your research and how Congress can help protect the health of not just our environment, but our constituents and the future generations. And with that, thank you again, Senator Merkley. If I can now hand it over to ranking member of our subcommittee, my friend and colleague, Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Chairman Merkley, and thank you, Chairman Padilla. As you were talking, I had a recollection and a mental image. I got to fly over Lake Tahoe in a very small plane.
I just wanted to lead with a couple of data points. And I first, just thank you all for your testimony and participation today. It's important and timely conversation, obviously. About 42% of adults, up from 33% just about 5 years ago, say that they have either used fertility treatments or personally know someone who has. And there are currently an estimated 1.5 million frozen embryos nationwide. The recent ruling in Alabama effectively bans IVF in certain states because it would subject people involved in all steps of the process to unreasonable criminal liability. As Republicans continue to stumble over the flawed arguments against reproductive rights What I see happening is they're realizing that it's one thing to say that you're opposed to abortion in theory, and it's a whole other thing to try to legislate in this new reality. Now, it's offensively hypocritical for so many House GOP members, for example, lining up to pledge support for IVF while simultaneously signing on to so-called parenthood legislation with no carve-out for embryos in clinics. My first question, Dr. Zahedi, how would you square Republican support for IVF with support for personhood legislation like the Life at Conception Act?
So thank you for that question, Senator. And if I'm understanding your question, I think the hardest part about all of this discussion is that reproductive justice is both about choosing when to have a family and choosing when not to, and then the safety around how you choose to parent your children as well. And the argument around IVF, they are, as in conjunction with the argument around why abortion care is necessary medical health care, is that you're taking away the autonomy of families to make the decisions that are best for them. And you're erasing grief and trauma for those families that are having to make decisions that are very difficult. Having known plenty of colleagues as well as friends who've had to undergo infertility treatment, that is a very difficult road for them. And then to have, their time and energy and responsibility taken from them by the state and told what they can and can't do with that is just as scary as what we're seeing with the patients who are coming to us for abortion care.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate the perspective as a physician in this, because for a party that claims to be about rights and freedoms and liberties, they're taking away rights and freedoms and liberties from families across the country. Dr. Myers, can you talk a little bit more about the societal and economic impacts of banning IVF?
Yeah, and I'll preface it by saying, since this has been a bit of a mixture of the personal and professional, my oldest child is an IVF baby and the product of a frozen embryo transfer. This really hits close to home for me, seeing what's happening in Alabama. So reproductive autonomy isn't just about young people avoiding parenthood until they're ready. It's about all people being able to become parents when they want to. And IVF has helped millions of people, including me, and the economic evidence suggests that it allows women to spend more time seeking the right partner, investing in education, and investing in their careers. And in a country and moment when we're increasingly seeing people delaying parenthood, a lack of access to IVF is very concerning from an economist perspective.
Thank you very much. And if I can, in my brief time remaining, I do want to touch on another topic because I think as Dr. Zahedi exemplifies, there across the country are obstetricians, gynecologists, and nurses that are leaving their practices in states like Idaho, Texas, Oklahoma, and Tennessee, while new doctors are avoiding those states altogether. Facing the departure of respected and talented physicians, many hospitals have since closed their labor and delivery units in these red states. So the brain drain extends beyond just maternity care. Following the Dobbs decision, a growing number of companies have updated their health insurance policies to include abortion travel benefits. And it's because they recognize the impact that state laws restricting abortion care have on their ability to attract and retain talent. Dr. Zahedi, can you, you left Georgia and Tennessee, as you shared in your testimony, as a result of Dobbs and the state's abortion restrictions. I can imagine that Republican attacks on reproductive health care is driving obstetricians and other healthcare professionals from red states. How does this impact access to essential healthcare services, including prenatal visits, including access to contraception, including maternal fetal medicine and postpartum care, cesarean sections, and more in those states that are being left behind?
Thank you so much for that question, Senator. I have a deep concern for what's going to happen in this country as these rights continue being taken away. We know even prior to Dobbs that states that had abortion care restrictions had worsening maternal mortality and morbidity, and that was still divided and worsened across racial lines as well. So now that we're adding in the factor that physicians are afraid to be in states where there are significant abortion bans, you're eliminating an entire workforce. And in addition, almost 50% of the OBGYN residents in this country are training in states with abortion care restrictions. We will graduate an entire generation of OBGYNs who don't know how to do D&Cs for miscarriage management, who aren't equipped to counsel patients appropriately about the findings of their pregnancies, who aren't going to be able to provide necessary emergency medical care in these communities, and I'm very afraid what that's going to mean for their patients. Idaho, for example, has had multiple maternity wards close over the last several years as almost 25% of their OBGYN workforce has left, and there is maybe 2 maternal fetal medicine physicians left in the entire state. Patients are traveling 200 miles one way for prenatal care now. In a state that already had really, terrible maternal mortality and morbidity, I worry what that means for the residents of that state, and how we're going to continue to watch women die.
Yeah.
Senator Kane, and then
Mr. Chair, just in closing, because obviously we have and will continue to have fiery debates as policymakers, and we're seeing what impact it's had on medical professionals in states across the country. But the ultimate consequence, and this is why you're having this hearing, the ultimate consequences are on women and families, and that needs to be at the center of our actions here. Thank you.
When we were in Southeast Asia in the Vietnam War, our squadron we were housed at Moffett Field Naval Air Station, and I lived very close to there in Palo Alto. And when we weren't overseas, I would recycle. And I found a warehouse about a mile from the apartment that some of my buddies and I lived in, and we go there pretty regularly every month, and I've never stopped. Good habit that I learned a long time ago in your state. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing as we explore the role of extended producer responsibility. I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that it's just one aspect of the circular economy for plastic. These policies should obviously work in tandem with other areas like recycling infrastructure investments, which we've talked about, improved data collection, because that can help inform future decisions in policymaking, and any other strategies that would leverage public-private partnerships and investment to achieve our goals. As the chairman said, I'm proud to represent California, who I believe has paved the way towards a circular economy for the benefit of both consumers and the environment. Thanks to California's leadership on recycling over the years, we've collected over 491 billion bottles and cans, including the ones that you recycled, Mr. Chairman. 1 billion pounds of carpet, right? Maybe a lot of people are familiar with the cans and bottles, but it's not just that. Carpet, 2.6 billion pounds of e-waste, because of electronics and its disproportionately impactful environmental damage if not disposed of properly. 2.2 billion gallons of used oil, and 9.6 million mattresses for recycling. I mean, we're going to take recycling and reuse everywhere we can find it. California is also one of the first states to enact extended producer responsibility legislation, with this landmark passage of SB 54 in 2022. This law requires producers to reduce single-use plastic packaging by 25% and make 100% of their packaging either recyclable or compostable by 2032. And reports estimate that the targets in the law would result in 23 million tons less of single-use plastics over the next 10 years. That sounds like a big figure. Let's try to envision what 23 million tons is. You familiar with the Golden Gate Bridge? 23 Golden Gate Bridges is what we're talking about, or 150,000 blue whales. Dr. Johnson, how can Congress best advance extended producer responsibility policies while also protecting states' abilities to act?
I do think there's an important role for states. What we would like to see is harmonization of product labeling, product characteristics, so that because our products flow freely across state borders, so that we don't have conflicts of laws and we can capture good economies of scale. To me, those are the two most important things that we need from a federal level, but states obviously should have, you know, a lot of capability to design these systems to meet their state's particular needs.
Right. And I think in addition, this is my position for the record here, I think we in Congress can learn what's worked at the state level and try to broaden that across the country while not preempting those states that can and want to be even more aggressive. It's an important balance in policy relationship to have. In my time remaining, I want to touch on at least one other topic. California was one of the first states to pass a beverage container deposit law, which established what Californians know as California's redemption value, the CRV, on beverage containers. Now, this fee, or deposit, as it's referred to, is either returned to consumers when they recycle their bottles and cans or given to a curbside operator or nonprofit recycler. And thanks to California's bottle bill, our beverage container recycling rate is at 70%. We've had higher marks at some point, but 70% is pretty successful. Ms. Simon, what other complementary recycling systems should be considered and incorporated into federal extended producer responsibility policies?
Thank you so much for the question, and thanks for your leadership. I think it's really important that we learn from what the states have been doing and what really creates sustainable secondary markets for all materials, because we do know that we are way outpacing the world's ability to produce all of the things we depend on, and we need to figure out how to get them back. So there's a lot of elements that we would build into a system like EPR that could extend beyond single-use products, right? You can learn from DRS to create, and how the incentives work in that, to enact incentives for reuse systems and recovery in the shared community. You can create better harmonization and design standards across a whole host of different product categories, right? We are primarily talking about municipal solid waste here and single-use materials, but there is apparel, there is electronics. There's a lot of other industries that are going to learn from what is happening in this space, and we should be considering those as we look at what type of mechanisms could be successful in helping us to recover those unneeded resources in one place and provide them for other industries in another.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I'll just remind us that recycling is the third of the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and then recycle. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director Young. Standing in for me, Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the consideration. First question, Director Young, in 5 words or less, how's the baby?
The baby went quietly and peacefully to daycare this morning, so the baby could not be better. She knew I had some place to be.
Not so baby anymore. In my time, there are 2 timely issues I'd like to cover with you, and I appreciate the call last week to begin the conversation on some of these. Colleagues, household water and sewer bills have increased by more than 50% this last decade, leaving 1 in 3 Americans struggling to pay their bills. Now, during the pandemic, we actually had a very successful low-income household water assistance program that was approved, which served more than 1.4 million households in 49 states, 5 U.S. territories, the District of Columbia, and 97 tribal communities. So I appreciate the administration's continued recognition of the successful program in the budget by allowing its continuation under LIHEAP. But at least until we can pass my legislation that would make LIWAP permanent. So in the meantime, we're providing, the goal there is to provide a separate long-term authorization of the program. But unfortunately, in appropriating the funds, Congress has failed to allow for the set-aside that the administration has proposed in this and previous budget requests. So Director Young, the question is the expansion of eligible uses to allow LIWOP services factored into the $4.1 billion funding level proposed for LIHEAP? Was this budgeted to ensure that HHS can provide both LIHEAP and LIWOP assistance without eating into the LIHEAP program? So can you speak to that and the importance of enacting an appropriations bill that reflects this goal?
One, I helped get that program started in the appropriations bill. It saved a lot of families from water cutoffs in the middle of a pandemic. How terrible that would have been had we not done something. And we absolutely support the set-aside 2.7% and believe that would allow the LIWOP program to continue without eating into the LIHEAP program, which is also incredibly important.
Okay, because obviously we don't want to eat into one program because they both have a significant merit and need. So look forward to working with you on establishing the permanent program when the time comes. The other issue I wanted to raise is well, let me just say, in that call last week, very much appreciate your recognition of the importance of following the science when it comes to the Mars sample return mission. For the first time in history, colleagues, we will launch a spacecraft from the surface of Mars with samples for detailed study. This effort is being led by the incredible team at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Southern California. And as you know, Congress was unequivocal in the appropriations many of us we enacted last week in support of the Mars sample return mission and in the larger decadal survey process that determines NASA's funding priorities. Director Young, could you reiterate for the record the Biden administration's commitment to supporting the independent review board assessment and the funding profile resulting from its conclusions?
We are so committed to making decisions based on the internal assessment that we held off on providing a 25 number while that assessment is being done. So we can put forward a 24 number because the appropriations bill asked us to take time and make sure we got that right, in addition to a 25 number after that assessment is done to make sure we get it right.
And can you assure me that both OMB and NASA are on the same page when it comes to this commitment?
We're both on the same page when it comes to this commitment. We are waiting for the internal review at NASA to conclude. Clearly, one of the things we'll look at is the long-term viability, the cost of the project. Lots of missions NASA has to undertake, but we are committed to following the science.
Okay, thank you very much. And in closing, Mr. Chair, just want to thank Director Young for the inclusion of $38.5 million for the Bajada River project to continue the important work safeguarding that historically underserved, largely farm worker community in California, and also for the increased funding for the International Boundary and Water Commission. We've been working closely with your office to address the needs of critical infrastructure around the Tijuana River.
And you know, we've supported that in the supplemental as well.
Thank you.
One that yield to Senator Padilla. Thank you for joining us, and you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Administrator Regan, I want to start by thanking you and your staff at the EPA for your collaboration, not just with my office, but a lot of state and local leaders in California on the many pressing chemical cleanup, clean water, and clean air challenges that we face in California. You know from our discussions and my many letters to you and to the agency that have been consistently focused on how to reduce emissions, especially across the transportation and goods movement sectors, which is why I'm so grateful for EPA's recent rulemakings on light-duty and heavy-duty vehicles. I understand they've gotten the attention of some of my colleagues on the committee on the other side of the aisle. So I want to ask you, Mr. Administrator, can you take a moment to reaffirm, not just for me, but for my friends on the other side of the aisle, that the final emissions rules for both light and heavy-duty vehicles do not, in fact, ban conventional combustion engines?
They absolutely don't.
Thank you. Clear, concise.
Yes.
Can you now spend a minute or two and emphasize the benefits of these rules to communities across the country, not just those in California, but across the country, and the people who live in these goods movement corridors?
Well, we know that there are over 72 million Americans that live along these corridors that are disproportionately impacted by these emissions, especially from our heavy-duty vehicles. On the HDV side, the final standards will provide over $13 billion in annual benefits to society. There are a lot of people that will be breathing cleaner air and living a healthier life because of these rules. Again, I think we've done it in a way where we've looked at the technology. It's not just us. I think, as I said before, the automobile industry are running $7 million Super Bowl ads talking about the benefits of these technologies. So we've aligned our regulations with where technology and the market is going. And if we don't do it, we will be beholden to China. We need to have these rules in place, improve our health and our environment, and we need to manufacture these components domestically.
Thank you. And just to underscore a statistic that can get lost on some, I believe you said about 72 million Americans.
72 million Americans.
Live along these goods movement corridors. That's, again, close to about 20% of the national population.
It's significant.
So an idea, a policy that can improve the lives, the health, the well-being of 1 in 5 Americans in one fell swoop is hugely consequential. Now, just in addition to all that work, I know and I know you know that we can't stop with cars and trucks given the significant pollution stemming from the rest of the freight system. California's ports, as busy as they are and as successful as they are, along with our freight system, move the goods that fuel not just the local and regional, but truly our national economy. Yet it's California communities that bear the burdens of the poor air quality and harmful climate impacts that come with goods movement. That's why I've consistently called on the EPA, as you know, to do more to reduce emissions from locomotives and ships and planes and off-road equipment as well. Now, the EPA and the administration do deserve a lot of credit for launching 2 efforts just this past month and a half to do just that. The administration launched a zero-emission freight corridor strategy to help guide the deployment of zero-emission infrastructure along freight highways, and you followed up last month by setting a national goal of a zero-emissions freight sector. Now, a national strategy encompassing the whole freight sector, including heavy-duty vehicles, ships, trains, and more, will help significantly reduce these harmful impacts on air quality, climate change, and public health, while improving American economic competitiveness and accelerating job creation. We've seen it happen in California. We want to really scale up. Mr. Administrator, can you describe what the next steps are that the EPA plans to take to implement both the freight corridor funding strategy and the national goal of achieving a zero-emission freight sector?
Well, I'll say, this is a very important topic, and I've spent time in Georgia, New Jersey, California, just visiting with these ports. This strategy is so important, and it's important that I, along with DOT, and many in the federal family are working together with the consolidated strategy. I would say that in addition to that strategy, where we are with the next steps is thanks to your leadership and the leadership of many in this committee. We've got $3 billion in grants that we're going to begin to dedicate to these ports to invest in these technologies, in these vehicles and the likes. Our ports want to be globally competitive. They know the future is driven by technology. They have welcomed this strategy and these investments with open arms. And I think not only are we going to make this country or keep this country globally competitive, we're going to save a lot of lives and we're going to reduce a lot of hospital visits.
Thank you very much. We've set ambitious goals. You visited. We've invested. We're setting more ambitious goals. You're going to continue to visit and look forward to seeing you soon back in California.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Padilla.
Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Wong, you testified today that providing a pathway to citizenship for dreamers would significantly improve the American economy. Right? A lot of us spend a lot of time in trying to do morally the right thing when it comes to dreamers and their families, but you're making an economic argument that doing so could potentially bring in billions of dollars in additional state and local tax revenue, create new jobs, and lead to a nearly $800 billion increase in our GDP. From those figures alone, the economic argument in favor of legalization, I think, is not just clear, but very compelling. However, as you may know, former President Trump has said that should he be elected to a second term, he would target millions of undocumented immigrants in a massive deportation campaign that, if successful, I can tell you would not just terrorize communities and lead to separation of families, ripping countless people from the only homes they've ever known, but I think you have the expertise to talk about what an economic impact such a massive deportation campaign would have on regional economies and our nation's economy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you for the question. So Dreamers currently contribute an estimated $45 billion per year in gross domestic product. If we no longer had DACA and subjected Dreamers to that massive deportation force that you mentioned, then we would lose out on that economic benefit. But more to the point, DACA recipients and Dreamers more generally aren't just economic units. They are people who are embedded in our communities. And so in our most recent survey of DACA recipients, what we did was conduct a survey experiment to figure out what life without DACA would be like for DACA recipients. And so, as I mentioned earlier, approximately 58% would be less likely to pursue education without DACA. Approximately 63% would be less likely to pursue new educational opportunities. Importantly, 43% say they would be less likely to look for new jobs, and 42% would be less likely to report wage theft by their employers. And so not only would we lose the economic benefits that Dreamers currently bring to the economy, but we would put Dreamers further into the shadows to the point where even if they were being abused by their employers, they wouldn't report it.
Thank you. And just to underscore the significance of your response, I want to remind us all of the distinction again, because our colleagues on the other side of the aisle keep muddling the issue. I'm not talking about people who may be on their way to the southern border to seek asylum or anything else. We're talking about long-term current residents of the United States and their work and their contributions to the success of communities in our country. Now, as we've heard today, it's been more than 2 decades since the DREAM Act was first introduced. It was in 2001 that our chairman, Chairman Durbin, and the late Senator Orrin Hatch introduced the DREAM Act the first time. It's been bipartisan since day one. The chair's been fighting for it ever since, and during all this time, Dreamers have grown up. They've graduated high school, we've graduated from college, many from graduate school. They've started families, and those lucky enough to have the protections that come with DACA have established careers. They become doctors and nurses and teachers and police officers, like Officer Soto Rodriguez, who's here with us today. But in all that time, Dreamers have also lived with the uncertainty and fear because of their status, and Congress's failure year after year to deliver for them. I'd like to ask Ms. Pacheco, who you said in your testimony that you're here representing not only your own journey, which is a powerful and inspiring one in and of itself, but you also represent the hopes and aspirations of millions like you who have lived through the ups and downs of this fight for many, many years. Can you please tell us what these past few decades have been like for you and others who've been waiting and waiting and waiting far too long for protections and certainty?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Well, it's been 4 administrations, Republicans and Democrats, in the last 20 years that we have seen this. And for me, the biggest devastation is seeing that today the average age of a DACA recipient is actually 29. They actually now have families. 1 in 10 of our scholars have a U.S. citizen child. They say that about 300,000 U.S. citizen children have a parent that has DACA. And for me, the thing that really hurts the most is seeing all the potential that the young people, many of them sitting in this room today, have and the desire to be able to contribute even more than they already are contributing to this country if they were to be allowed to be U.S. citizens.
Thank you. I have additional questions, but my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Tillis.
Thank you, Professor Armstrong. I'm going to defer to my colleagues who I think may have other places to go, and we'll start with Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Senator Booker. Yes, indeed, we're excited about it. I'm not going to preempt the announcement, but some good news coming out of the Bureau of Reclamation at Department of Interior this afternoon for California water users. And I'll just leave it at that for now, but appreciate the flexibility here. And thank you to all the witnesses for participating today. To help address the growing wildfire threat facing California, we have long relied on the Conservation Camp Program, which is our State Department of Corrections volunteer firefighting program. The incarcerated individuals who volunteer to join the Conservation Camp Program have at times comprised up to 40% of the state's total firefighting force. So it's not insignificant. And I do want to make it a point to emphasize the voluntary nature of this program. It's voluntary, but so attractive that we've often see waiting lists for incarcerated individuals who want to participate in the program. Now, many participants in California's firefighting program have described the experience as valuable for building real-life skills. And more than 300 formerly incarcerated firefighters have used these qualifications and actual certification. So it's not just the skills, the training, and the experience, but certification to go on to earn a job with CAL FIRE, the state's firefighting force. I think this program can serve as a model for how we help incarcerated individuals develop useful skills and the necessary certifications to help them find meaningful, well-paying work post-release. My first question is for Ms. Armstrong. How can we build on this model in California to help establish clear links between prison labor work and opportunities for employment post-release?
One of the most significant features, I believe, of the California system is the fact that legal roadblocks to people serving as firefighters upon release were removed. Right? And so when we think about what happens behind bars, the things that people are trained for, it is also just as important to look at, are there barriers to them assuming those professions and vocations after the fact? The second thing that I would mention about the California program is something that I hear from other programs, and I believe Mr. Nguyen also mentioned today, which is being trained in the helping professions, teaching, tutoring, nursing. Those professions that help others can be life-changing in terms of the rehabilitative potential of prisons. Thank you.
Thank you. And sort of a follow-up question for Ms. Turner. Can you speak to the issue of helping incarcerated individuals obtain the necessary certifications themselves to actually utilize the skills they're developing in a post-release work?
Yes, thank you for your question, Senator. Yes, this is an important feature of vocational programs that will be successful and set people up for success upon release. But the reality is that more than 80% of incarcerated workers are engaged in maintenance work that isn't setting them up for those jobs. But certainly the path forward requires us to expand these vocational programs, to expand job opportunities that can directly lead to work opportunities after release, including direct lines to employment, letters of recommendation, skills training in industries that are projected to increase in the workforce. The reality is that many, even of our vocational programs, are in areas of work that are declining. Legislative oversight of prison industries programs in Texas and Mississippi, for instance, found that they were training people in jobs that are little to no job prospects, such as garment industry manufacturing or farm work. But there are examples of programs that and opportunities here to provide people with the training that will set them up for gaining stable employment after their release from prison.
So I know there's different types of vocational programs. You see examples
Absolutely.
in states across the country. Coming back to California for a second. Now, California takes steps to ensure that the wildfire work, which comes with risk, it's not easy, can be dangerous, but so it's important to make sure that the program is truly voluntary. We're not forcing inmates to perform this work. But often, how often are incarcerated individuals recruited to work jobs, and how do we make sure that they are not being forced to work? Can you comment on what policies and safeguards should be in place to ensure that it's truly voluntary and not forced labor?
Sure. So currently, nearly all states in the federal prison have compulsory work programs, and there are clear punishments levied against people who are unwilling or unable to perform the job assigned to them, including solitary confinement, denial of good time credits or opportunities to reduce their sentence, and denial of access to call home or have family visitation. We need to end these punishments. We also need to amend the 13th Amendment and state exclusion clauses that permit forced labor and slavery for people convicted of a crime. But the implementation is important as well, ending punishments that are levied against people for inability or refusal to work, and ensuring that when people are unable to work because of a disability, infirmity, age, will receive permission not to perform the job assigned to them, including people with disabilities. And we need to comply with existing federal disability laws, which most prisons are not doing so with respect to job assignments for people with disabilities.
Okay, thank you.
And I just wanted to add, California is not alone in using incarcerated workers to fight wildfires. It's one of at least 14 states that does so, and not all these programs are fully voluntary, and we have seen serious injuries and deaths result from this work, both for non-incarcerated and incarcerated workers. But when people are desperate to support themselves and need to support themselves while incarcerated and facing legal financial obligations, that $1 an hour, for instance, in California, is a very powerful incentive. And we see some states truly rely on incarcerated workers to perform this work, including, for instance, Georgia. 1/3 of counties rely on incarcerated firefighters to respond to motor vehicle accidents, wildfires, and house fires. And these workers are not paid a cent for their work.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, appreciate the accommodation.
Thank you very much. Senator.
As if in legislative session and notwithstanding Rule 22, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Rules and Administration be discharged from further consideration of S 4292. And the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, I've read the measure that is being attempted to be brought up by this motion. And I want to make one thing perfectly clear. It is already a federal crime for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. Every member of the Senate should know that. In fact, any non-citizen convicted of even registering to vote could face up to 5 years in prison. And every single state has a law prohibiting non-citizens from voting in federal elections. And the consequences for non-citizens go beyond prison time. Claiming to be a U.S. citizen under penalty of perjury while registering to vote or while actually voting are deportable offenses. So it's already against the law with significant consequences for violations. And in fact, experts have found that voting by non-citizens is exceedingly rare. A study of the 2016 election, for example, found that non-citizen votes accounted for, let me get this right, 0.0001%. Doing the math, that's about 30 incidents of suspected, not even proven, suspected non-citizens voting out of 23.5 million votes cast. What does that tell us? It tells us that our current laws are working. Don't just take my word for it. The Cato Institute agrees. In November of 2020, the Cato Institute found that, quote, non-citizens don't illegally vote in detectable numbers, end quote. So colleagues, plain and simple, this bill is a solution in search of a problem. What it attempts to do is once again make it harder for eligible Americans to vote or to discourage people from voting, particularly American citizens who happen to be experiencing homelessness, for U.S. citizens of color, for U.S. citizens without driver's licenses. Do they have any less of a right to vote than any of us, or less of a claim to our country? I speak today, Mr. President, as both a former California Secretary of State as well as being a member of this body. And I've always believed that our democracy works best when as many eligible people participate. That's why I, along with several of our Democratic colleagues, introduced the Freedom to Vote Act. Now, the Freedom to Vote Act does not extend registration or voting rights to non-citizens. What does the Freedom to Vote Act do? It includes pro-voter policies for eligible Americans like early voting, vote by mail. Imagine that, making it easier for eligible U.S. citizens to exercise their franchise. That's the American way. Whereas this bill would only serve as yet another barrier to participation by imposing not just extremely burdensome, but unnecessary requirements on registering to vote. And so therefore, Mr. President, I object.
Heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, it's unfortunate that we didn't have the chance to pass this today. I would love to have passed it. The reason I'd have loved to have passed it is because it's my friend and distinguished colleague, the senator from California, has just noted it's illegal for a non-citizen to vote. And because it's illegal for a non-citizen to vote, we need to make sure that it doesn't happen. The fact that it's prohibited by a law with federal criminal penalties attached to it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, doesn't mean that it couldn't happen, doesn't mean that it's not more likely to happen when we bring a whole lot more non-citizens into the country. There are now an estimated 30 million or so non-citizens inside the United States. Now, my friend and colleague from California cites a couple of studies. One of those studies is from the Cato Institute from 2020. This was about 12 million non-citizens ago. Under this administration, we've let in an additional 12 million or so non-citizens into the United States. That rapid of an influx can cause problems. He also cites another study from 2016. That 2016 study was probably 15 or 16 million non-citizens ago. Things do change. Now, the Cato study, the one from 2020 that he mentioned, says that there's no evidence that non-citizens are voting in detectable numbers. It doesn't mean it's not happening. It may mean that they're difficult to detect. But the more non-citizens we have, and the more time that elapses when the National Voter Registration Act, or NVRA, remains intact, the more predictable, foreseeable, and indeed likely it becomes that many people, some of them perhaps maliciously, knowingly, intending to violate the law, others who might be in sort of a gray area, not quite realizing what they're doing or the fact that it's illegal, might end up registering to vote. Let's remember, in 1993, Congress passed the so-called motor voter law, the National Voter Registration Act. Made it very easy to register to vote in federal elections. All you have to do is check a box and sign your name. It's all on the honor system. If you do that, you're registered to vote. Now, fast forward 2 decades. The Supreme Court of the United States decides a case interpreting the National Voter Registration Act as prohibiting the states, preempting the field in such a way that states may not request any proof, any evidence of citizenship when registering someone to vote such that they would be eligible to cast a vote in a federal election. So, meanwhile, we've got a change in trend Decades ago, when the NVRA was passed, number one, we had far fewer illegal aliens in the country. We also, number two, had a lot of states that wouldn't issue a driver's license or were reluctant to do so to someone who was illegally in the United States. It's now the case that at least 19 states issue driver's licenses to individuals who are unlawfully, illegally in the United States. All 50 states plus the District of Columbia issue driver's licenses to non-citizens generally. What that means is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 million people, or at least the adult segment, that portion of the nearly 30 million people who are non-citizens inside the United States today, all they've got to do is go get a driver's license, which most of them, if they have any interaction with other members of society, are likely to do, to go get a driver's license. You need a driver's license for all kinds of things. Once they do that, if they check that box and sign their name, all in the honor system, they'll be registered to vote. Not only does the state not necessarily know that they're non-citizens and ineligible to vote, the state is legally constrained, legally prohibited from asking for any evidence establishing whether or not they're citizens. So this really is concerning. We shouldn't treat it lightly. And the fact that it is difficult to detect makes it more important, not less, to require evidence supporting citizenship. Look, we have to do this in other contexts. Anyone who travels abroad or might at some point in the future travel abroad will have to apply for a U.S. passport. To do that, you're going to have to produce some sort of evidence of U.S. citizenship. When you start a new job in the United States, you have to fill out an I-9 form. Under the I-9 form, if you're a non-citizen, you have to produce evidence of your visa and your eligibility under your visa program to work. But if you are not here on a visa and you're an American, then you have to produce evidence that you are, in fact, a citizen of the United States. So if you have to produce that stuff to get a passport, if you have to produce that stuff whenever you start a new job, why would it not make sense to require proof of citizenship upon registering to vote in a federal election? How else are we supposed to protect our elections, our sacred elections within our constitutional republic, from foreign interference? Look, Mr. President, one person, one vote. One citizen, one vote. This is how it's supposed to work. This is a foundational principle. And it's under an unprecedented threat today. And it's under threat specifically because President Biden and Secretary Mayorkas have refused willfully to enforce the law. And now we face a direct threat to our electoral system as a result. Consider this. Since President Biden's inauguration, over 9.5 million undocumented immigrants have entered the United States illegally and have been observed. An estimated 12 million or so have come in. That includes the people estimated to have entered without being observed. This figure exceeds the populations of 36 U.S. states, creating a crisis that's been met with just troubling silence and inaction from many across the aisle. With millions of unauthorized entrants onto U.S. soil, the potential for election fraud through ineligible voting is not just a hypothetical risk, it's a looming reality. Instead of urging the President of the United States to address this crisis, Democrats seem to prefer to resurrect the so-called Orwellian-named Border Security Act, a bill that has already failed in this body and will do nothing to mitigate the border issues at hand, the border issues created and then exacerbated by this administration. With the influx of non-citizens under this administration, even if just a fraction, let's say 1 in 100, were to vote, This could translate to hundreds of thousands of votes. Enough certainly to sway your tightly contested elections and potentially alter the outcomes, even in something as significant and with nationwide implications as far-reaching as a presidential election. This is concerning, considering that a recent study found that non-citizens have ample openings to illegally vote. Somewhere from between 10% and 27% of non-citizens are registered to vote, and somewhere between 5% and 13% of non-citizens vote in federal elections, including presidential elections. Across the nation, instances abound where states have inadvertently facilitated the crisis. I say inadvertently, but in some ways their hands are tied. Inadvertently here sort of refers to the fact that they don't necessarily mean to. It's that they're prohibited from asking for proof of citizenship. From unsolicited voter registration forms mailed to non-citizens to driver's licenses issued without adequate checks, practices relying merely on the honesty of non-citizens, including illegal aliens, have opened the floodgates to voter fraud. And while it's true that it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, there really are no effective systems in place to verify the citizenship of voters. A mere check on a box is all it takes, with little risk, very little risk of being caught due to inadequate state election infrastructure. Federal law even prevents states from requiring proof of citizenship when registering voters via federal forms. An increasing number of localities permit non-citizens to vote in local elections, further blurring the distinctions meant to protect the integrity of our elections. Prominent Democrats have openly discussed these tactics as not just existing elements, but as things that are beneficial to their agenda. Only months ago, every Senate Democrat voted to count illegal aliens in the census to help them shore up more seats in Congress and more electoral votes in the Electoral College. This cannot continue. It's our responsibility, it's our moral imperative to close these gates. My bill, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, also known as the SAVE Act, would be a vital step in securing the electoral process, ensuring that every state, in every state, every vote cast is legitimate and every voter is duly registered. The SAVE Act proposes amending the National Voter Registration Act to enable states to require proof of citizenship when registering voters for purposes of federal elections. Under the SAVE Act, we mandate that states obtain concrete documentary proof of citizenship at the time of voter registration. It specifies acceptable documentation that really is desperately needed. It's far more injurious. If you want to compare the two, if you want to talk about the amount of burdensome paperwork that goes on relative to what it is that needs protecting, I think it's at least as harmful, if not far more so, to fail to require documentation and proof of citizenship in the context of voting in a federal election than it is when completing an I-9, which everyone has to do when they start a new job, citizen and non-citizen alike. Furthermore, the SAVE Act compels states to proactively remove non-citizens from voter rolls and introduces federal penalties for those who intentionally register non-citizens. This bill echoes the sentiments of the American people from coast to coast. It transcends political affiliations and speaks directly to the core of what makes our country great: fair, free, and secure elections. This is about preserving the integrity of our elections and ensuring that each state have the opportunity to participate in a way that involves each vote being cast to reflect the American will. And if this administration insists upon keeping America's borders open, then the administration must also ensure that none of these illegal immigrants are thwarting our free and fair elections. Look, This border crisis, make no mistake, was deliberately engineered and has been willfully perpetuated by this administration. Now, they shouldn't want open borders. There are a lot of bad reasons, a lot of good reasons why this is a bad idea, a lot of reasons why we shouldn't allow this. There are a lot of people like Lake and Riley who have lost their lives or otherwise endured heartache, trauma, and devastating consequences because of people who should not be here to begin with. But if this is what they want, then for the love of all that is sacred and holy, please, they should at a minimum have the decency to their fellow Americans to make sure that those same people who they've willfully allowed to enter our country against our law and against the will of the American people, to at least not be able to vote in our elections because they're not citizens. Every day we delay the foundation of our electoral processes erodes a little more. We can't wait for this administration to enforce the law because this administration isn't enforcing the law. By passing the SAVE Act, we send a clear message that in the United States, voting is not just a right and a privilege of citizenship, but it's also a protected and a cherished one that our own government won't deliberately allow to be diluted and made less meaningful. As debates about election integrity rage, the SAVE Act stands out by guaranteeing that only American citizens will have a say in our elections, and thereby keeping those elections free from foreign interference, something we all care about. American elections must be decided by American voters. Full stop.
I would like to expand on a topic that I raised in my introductions to the nominees from California, and that's the value, not just the importance, but the value of diversity in our judiciary. Clearly, you each bring tremendous both life as well as professional experience, which I think strengthens the judiciary when more perspectives are considered in the deliberations. So I want to extend it further because it's not just the thoughts and experiences that you bring to the table. I think it also has tremendous value when the public views the judiciary. When decisions are made, sometimes, for the prosecution side, sometimes for the defense side, knowing that people are seen, knowing that people are heard adds to the public confidence in the decisions and in the results of the process. But going one step further, it's not just those who sit on the bench that are important in this process. I know everybody who sits on the bench relies on law clerks. And I think you can each speak to an experience you've had as a clerk and what that quality clerkship experience did for you. The opportunity to serve as a law clerk is oftentimes a launching pad for a successful career in the legal profession, whether it's the public sector or in the private sector. Yet statistics show that quality clerkship opportunities and experiences often leave out equally qualified young lawyers of color. And so my question is, do you agree with the premise that more diversity is better for the judiciary? If not, I'd be interested in hearing why. If you do agree, then what would you do if you're fortunate enough to be confirmed to pursue increasing diversity in your courtroom, starting with Judge Court?
Thank you, Senator. I do agree with the premise of your question. And one of the things that I do now is I do outreach in to the traditional places, law schools, things of that nature. But also I look for opportunities to mentor and opportunities to do non-traditional outreach because of the fact that it is my experience that there are some very talented people who might be interested in entering the pipeline either into the law or into the judiciary that self-select out because either they don't see themselves in that space or because the opportunities don't present themselves to them. So I would continue to do the work that I do to make sure that the outreach I do is very expansive and inclusive.
Thank you. Judge Huang.
Thank you. I agree that diversity is very important. As a judge, I think it's important to cast a wide net in interviewing potential law clerks. And as a sitting judge, what I have done in addition is talk to law students also about externing and the value of externing as well as clerking. And so I've given talks at various law schools and with law students about the value in one's career, but also in the experience of being able to see the courts in action and for people to seek out these opportunities.
Thank you. Judge Hepburn.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. I agree with your value statement, and I agree with the comments of my colleagues. I'll just say that one of the things that I have done as a judge looking for law clerks is to look not just at the sort of traditional elite law schools that tend to be feeders to the federal clerkship path, but to look for very high-performing students at other law schools. I've also had great success hiring law clerks who came to the law after prior careers. I had a law clerk who was a chef. I had a law clerk who was an artist. I had a law clerk who was a minister. And I think bringing in that diversity of life experiences also was valuable. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Ms. Newman.
Thank you. I have a point of order, Madam Chair.
Well, I had a birthday a couple months ago. I'm just thinking, is that a jab? Thank you, Mr. Chair. And congratulations, Judge Kidd. You're going to be able to tell pretty easily that we are the two senators representing California because we both enjoy emphasizing the value of diversity in this committee and in our questions of nominees that come before us. So appreciate listening to the conversation I walked in on about the diverse perspectives that are important to have on the bench. Firm believer and cheerleader for diversity on the bench, not just because I think it improves the work product of the federal judiciary when there are people with a wide variety of both life and professional experiences that feed into the deliberations and the decisions. But in addition to that, I think as we're working to restore public confidence in the federal judiciary, we'll leave the Supreme Court alone here for a minute, but at all levels. And so coming into this process with that mindfulness, not just of what you and your potential service would represent, but I heard your mention about expanding the opportunities and access for clerkships, because you know how important clerkships can be for young attorneys as they're beginning their careers, whether it's in public service or in the private sector and beyond. So I heard a couple of the ideas that you mentioned. I don't know if there's any others of what you would do if you're fortunate enough to be confirmed to continue to broaden that reach and diversity for clerks in your courtroom.
Yes, Senator. So in addition to what I spoke about earlier, I do believe that there are things that we can do to improve the pipeline. Pipeline, I think, is part of the problem, the issue that can be addressed. So I have participated in several pipeline programs that are developed to address the pipeline. Such the Administrative Office of the Federal Courts had one a year or two ago about magistrate judges, and it was really to inform lawyers, law students about the process of becoming a magistrate judge, to kind of pull the curtain back a little bit on that process and to encourage people who might not otherwise think of themselves as someone who could be a magistrate judge to give that a second thought and provide resources for them and an opportunity to speak to current magistrate judges. So in that way, addressing school groups the same way, law schools especially, I think is another way to address that problem of just putting in there in law students' minds the idea that that is something that they want to do, so that then we then have a better pool of applicants to draw from.
Look, I'm a big believer in those pipeline programs, as you call them, or outreach programs, as I understood them. I am not an attorney. I'm an engineer, and if it wasn't for those outreach programs when I was in high school, I don't think I would have thought of it or certainly achieved it. So there's a lot of value there. In the time remaining, I'm going to sort of flip the script a little bit on you. Because we've already talked about diversity and ideas on how to do better outreach here. So for those aspiring lawyers watching at home, for that young person, maybe a law student, maybe an undergrad, maybe a high school student, or even younger, with a little bit of an idea or a dream of maybe someday becoming a federal judge, share with us and share with them what inspired you to pursue this career path.
Thank you for that, Senator. I am not someone who grew up in a family of lawyers. I grew up in a working class family. It was a great family, but no lawyers in my family. So it's not something that I thought about when I was going through high school, or really even until about junior year of college, when I took a course on constitutional law, which I thought was really fascinating, and I developed a relationship with that professor. And then at that point, I decided to go to law school. So it was really that point that I decided that law was something that I was interested in. And in terms of being a judge, I would say my clerkship with Judge Gregory on the Fourth Circuit was instrumental in that. Again, I did not have judges in my family growing up, so seeing him and how he approached the law and the importance to him of being in the community and community service as a judge, and working with him behind the scenes in each case, that's what really inspired me to someday think that I myself might want to be a judge one day. So I would encourage anyone who has an inkling of going to law school to talk to people, develop those types of relationships with their professors, if they know any judges, and to, if they do decide to go to law school, give clerking a thought.
Oh, well, two great lessons today: the value of pipeline programs and the value of mentorship.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Padilla. Senator Blackburn, we'll give you a moment to compose yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Judge Kidd.
For your accommodation and your consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity. Mr. Director, how are you this morning?
Yeah, thank you. Very well.
Good. Thank you for being here. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you about a subject that I've been familiar with for a long, long time. And I'm speaking specifically to the dynamic of immigration and its impact on our economy. Coming from the state of California, not just the most populous state in the nation, the most diverse state in the nation, home to more immigrants than any state in the nation. And it has the largest economy of any state in the nation as well. So we know full well that immigration and the contributions of immigrants is critical to the economy and critical to the growth of the United States. And now, thanks to the hard work of the CBO, you've all crunched the numbers and now project that U.S. revenue will be $1.2 trillion higher over the next 10 years because of the impact of migrants and migrants in the workforce as we see it today. And I would imagine that given my Republican colleagues' obsession with our debt, that they would welcome the news that CBO also found that this increased immigration, migrants, and their impact on the workforce leads to lower deficits. So it seems like it's something that we ought to embrace. So would you please speak to how the CBO was able to quantify the economic benefits of immigration and what the impact would be on revenues to the federal treasury if more than 10 million undocumented immigrants, many in the workforce, were to be deported?
Yes, so we haven't analyzed the deportation, but there's a sense in which it would be the opposite of the immigration increase that you mentioned. And so we said there's about a $9 trillion increase in GDP from the immigrants coming in. They add to the labor force, they pay taxes, they fill jobs. And so deportation would in some sense reverse that there'd be a big negative hit to GDP, the labor force would shrink, and revenue would go down.
Okay. That seems pretty logical to me, so thank you for that. I know you're from the CBO, not the Department of Labor, but I also think if we look at the data that is out there, even with the level of migration we've seen in the course of the last decade, we are experiencing record sustained low levels of unemployment. And wages continue to rise. So for those concerned, those who spread the false rhetoric that, well, immigrants are taking American jobs or they're a downward force on wages, that has proven to be false. Do you have any data that would suggest otherwise?
No, that's right. That there's a sense in which the immigration surge explains how our economy continued to grow rapidly and create jobs, even when the labor market, say 2 years ago, looked to be tight. It's the immigrants adding to the labor force. These are additional jobs and additional income.
Right. So I also want to ask about a related dynamic that is a priority concern for this committee. We've, see Senator Braun has joined us, and he's always one of the first, if not the first, to raise concerns about the debt. We're talking about the contributions of immigrants to the workforce and to the economy, and the net benefit that there's been on revenues, debt reduction, et cetera. But we also speak in this committee regularly about the solvency of our social safety net programs, particularly Social Security and Medicare. Now, between 2010 and 2020, the U.S. saw its slowest population growth of any decade since the 1930s. And it presents a huge challenge to those social safety net programs that rely on current workers to fund the benefits for America's retirees. And we know that immigrants help sustain the programs like Social Security and Medicare, even though they don't benefit from those programs themselves. In 2022 alone, immigrants paid over $570 billion in federal, state, and local taxes. So would you please discuss the impact on the solvency of our social safety net programs if, due to potential change in our immigration policies, we would realize a significant reduction in our workforce?
Yeah, and so we looked carefully at the composition of the immigration surge, and they're very heavily skewed toward working age adults. These are immigrants have a high propensity to work, and they have a strong incentive to work on the books once they receive authorization, generally within 6 months. Many of them will face a hearing in 7 to 10 years, and working on the books will let them in some demonstrate attachment. So all of that means more revenue for Social Security, increases the financial, improves the financial situation of the Social Security system, and and that's again, it's just like the overall revenue. Some of it goes to Social Security.
Okay. Couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Madam President, one citizen, one vote. Today, this foundational principle is under attack. It's under attack because President Biden refuses to enforce the law. And now we face a direct threat to our entire electoral system. Consider this. Since President Biden's inauguration on January 20th, 2021, over 10 million illegal immigrants have entered the United States. Now, this figure exceeds the populations of 36 states, creating a crisis that has been met with troubling silence and inaction from far too many on the other side of the aisle. With millions of unauthorized people now on U.S. soil, living here in the United States. The potential for election fraud through ineligible voting is not just a hypothetical risk. No, it is a looming reality. With the influx of non-citizens under this administration, even if just a fraction, let's just say something like 1 in 100 were to vote, this could translate to hundreds of thousands of votes, enough to sway our tightly contested elections and potentially alter their outcomes. This is deeply concerning, considering that a recent study showed that non-citizens have ample openings to vote illegally. It found that anywhere from 10 to 27% of non-citizens are registered to vote, and 5 to 13% of non-citizens do actually vote in presidential elections, no less. Across the nation, instances abound where states have inadvertently facilitated this very crisis. From unsolicited voter registration forms being mailed out to non-citizens, to driver's licenses issued without adequate checks, practices relying merely on the honesty of illegal aliens have opened up the floodgates to voter fraud. While it's true that it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, there are no effective systems in place to verify the citizenship of voters. A mere check on a box is all it takes, with little risk of being caught. In short, you're on the honor system with those forms. Federal law even prohibits states from requiring proof of citizenship when registering voters via federal forms. So it's not just that the states aren't doing an adequate job of verifying citizenship as a condition precedent to registering to a vote in a federal election. They're prohibited by law from doing so. An increasing number of localities permit non-citizens to vote in local elections. And this makes it even worse. It further blurs the distinctions that have historically been meant to protect the integrity of our elections. Prominent Democrats have openly discussed these tactics, in many instances, as beneficial to their agenda, as likely to help their political ambitions. Only months ago, every Senate Democrat voted to count illegal aliens in the census to help them shore up more seats in Congress and consequently more votes in the Electoral College. This cannot continue. It's our responsibility, our imperative, to close these gates. My bill, the SAVE Act, would ensure that this stops, because it would be a vital step in securing the electoral process, ensuring that every vote cast is legitimate and every voter is duly recognized and registered and properly brought into the system so that they can vote. The SAVE Act amends the National Voter Registration Act, the same act that was interpreted a few years ago by the Supreme Court as prohibiting the states from requesting any positive proof of citizenship, so that states could ensure that only U.S. citizens may participate in federal elections. It fixes the NVRA. If the NVRA was interpreted that way, this would close that loophole. The SAVE Act requires states to obtain concrete documentary proof of citizenship at the time of voter registration. It specifies acceptable documentation and requires states to establish alternatives, alternative verification processes for those rare instances in which standard documents might be unavailable. Furthermore, the SAVE Act compels states to proactively remove non-citizens from voter rolls and introduces severe federal penalties for those who intentionally register non-citizens. This bill echoes the sentiments of the American people from coast to coast. It transcends political affiliations, with an overwhelming bipartisan supermajority of Americans supporting it. And it speaks directly to the core of what makes our country great: fair, free, and secure elections operating within our constitutional republic. This is about protecting our elections from foreign interference, something my Democratic colleagues claim to care about and long have. If we truly want our elections to be free of foreign interference, then by all means pass the SAVE Act. Let's pass it today. Let's pass it right now. So for those of my colleagues who are opposed to this, why aren't they concerned with the ability of tens of millions of foreign nationals, non-citizens in the United States, to vote in America? Why should we allow tens of millions of foreign nationals who are not citizens in the United States to vote in U.S. elections? Now, if the Biden administration insists on keeping America's border open, as to my great dismay, it has, for the entirety of the 3.5 years or so Biden's been in office, they're going to insist on keeping the borders open. By all means, they must, at least at a bare minimum, ensure that none of those non-citizens are interfering in our elections. Every single day that we delay, the foundation of our electoral process erodes a little more. We cannot wait for this administration to enforce the law, to enforce the border, which they haven't done. They continue to refuse to do it. More people continue to enter. But in the meantime, they've let in 10 million illegal aliens. You add that to those who are already here, an estimated 30 million non-citizens currently reside in the United States. But this administration just keeps right on trucking, not doing anything about this problem. And in fact, this administration strongly opposes this legislation. Now, let's run through the reasoning. The reasoning is really telling. There are several arguments raised by the White House in the statement they issued just earlier this week. First, the White House protests, quote, "It is already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. It is a federal crime punishable by prison and fines," close quote. Now, to be clear, that is on its face a correct statement of the law. I won't disagree with the statement on its four corners, but the conclusion is really messed up. As I've already stated, there's absolutely no functioning mechanism for enforcing the law, and it's worse than that. It's not just that current law doesn't create an adequate enforcement mechanism. It's that current law, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, affirmatively prohibits the states from doing what they would need to do in order to prevent non-citizens from registering to vote and subsequently voting in federal elections, contrary to federal law. Meanwhile, DOJ investigations of illegal voting are all but non-existent. A law without enforcement cannot, will not stop illegal behavior. And there are many, many circumstances in which, notwithstanding the fact that the underlying conduct is criminally prohibited, you still need some sort of verification mechanism to make it enforceable. By the White House's own logic, it'd be unnecessary and perhaps even unwise to have laws requiring a photo ID to buy beer and cigarettes. You know, we've got these laws on the books, after all, that already make it a crime to sell beer and cigarettes to children. So according to the White House's logic, we shouldn't need an additional law requiring age verification with a photo ID. Now, nobody would be that crazy, that insane to make that argument there. We shouldn't be making it here. It's the same argument, the exact same argument. Next, in second position, the administration makes the unsubstantiated claim that, quote, "the justification for the SAVE Act is based on easily disproven falsehoods," close quote, end of sentence. But then, well, the administration utterly fails, defiantly refuses to offer anything to support that statement. And it's ironic because that justification for opposing it, on grounds that the justification for the SAVE Act is based on disproven falsehoods. This is its own disproven falsehood. There's nothing there. There's no falsehood that's been disproven. They have not disproven the fact that non-citizens, whether legally or illegally in this country at the time, can easily obtain a voter registration, eligibility to vote in federal elections, or the physical ability to do it, rather, so long as they're willing to check a box and sign their name. They don't dispute the fact that in all 50 states and D.C., a non-citizen can apply for and receive a driver's license, or that the National Voter Registration Act makes it easy when applying for a driver's license to check a box and sign your name and thereby register to vote in federal elections. When you add to that the fact that states are affirmatively legally prohibited based on the Supreme Court's interpretation of the NVRA a few years ago, saying that the states cannot, may not, must not ask for any kind of documentation to verify citizenship, we've got a problem. So for them to say that our justification for the SAVE Act is based on falsehoods, on easily disproven falsehoods, is itself easily disproven, and it's a falsehood. Third, the administration asserts that, quote, making a false claim of citizenship or unlawfully voting in an election is punishable by removal from the United States and a permanent bar to admission, close quote. Well, this is an interesting argument. This one is rich, Mr. President, coming from this administration. Look, well, it's true that the naturalization form has a self-reporting mechanism that asks the applicant if the applicant has ever voted illegally. Yeah, that's true. As far as I can tell, even when they do self-report, in those, I suspect, rare instances where they do, absolutely nothing has been done with that information under the Biden administration. Joe Biden isn't deporting anyone for illegally voting. Joe Biden has opened the floodgates and just lets people come in. So that's rich coming from this administration, suggesting that there's going to be suddenly rigorous enforcement of laws governing our border security. In this instance, when, number one, they're not doing it, and number two, everywhere you look, they're doing the opposite of that. Fourth, the administration asserts, quote, states already have effective safeguards in place to verify voters' eligibility and maintain the accuracy of voter rolls. Mr. President, that assertion is simply flat out wrong. It's just false. It's false factually, and it's false legally, meaning it is not true and it cannot be true by operation of law for reasons I've just explained. States are legally prohibited from requiring proof of citizenship when registering to voters, when registering voters for federal elections. This, I fear, may well be a feature, not a bug, for the administration, and a reason for the administration to oppose it, tragically. We'll get back to that more in a moment. But look, this loophole that I'm describing, based on the Supreme Court's interpretation of the NVRA, telling states that they may not and must not ask for any kind of evidence of citizenship, that's a gaping loophole that we must fix. Lastly, the administration claims that instead of safeguarding our elections, this bill, with its incredibly generous list of ways to demonstrate citizenship, would make it harder for Americans to vote. Well, look, the reality is that there's an expansive list of ways to demonstrate citizenship, even if you lack the documentation traditionally involved in proving it. And keep in mind, it's not unusual for Americans to be asked for proof of citizenship. Every single time an American citizen starts new employment, starts a new job, and they fill out an I-9, they've got to provide proof of citizenship. And if you're not a citizen, you've got to show evidence of your visa and your eligibility to work in the United States under that visa. If you can't do that, you can't start a job. This happens all the time. This is not as if the ability to prove citizenship and a requirement that one do so is foreign to us. Nor is it the case under this bill that it would be exceptionally difficult, because even if you're one of those rare individuals who, for whatever reason, doesn't have or have access to a birth certificate or something else that could prove it, we've got a long list of other ways that you can do it, even if you lack the traditionally utilized documentation. This bill allows all American citizens to vote. More importantly, if enacted, it would mean that no American vote could be canceled out by a vote cast illegally by a non-citizen. This bill would make it harder to cheat in elections and ensure the integrity of every ballot lawfully cast. There is no valid argument against the SAFE Act, Mr. President. None. The only reason to oppose this bill would exist if you needed illegal votes to win elections. Full stop, that's it. By passing the SAVE Act, we would send a clear message that in the United States of America, voting is not just a privilege of citizenship, but a cherished and protected right. As debates about election integrity rage, the SAVE Act stands out by guaranteeing that only American citizens can have a say in our elections. American elections must be decided by American voters, full stop. And so, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 8281, which is at the desk. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from California.
Mr. President, I ask you this. How many times do we have to go through this? Less than 2 months ago, I came down to the floor of the Senate to object to this very same bill, expressing concerns, asking questions, and here we are again, and nothing has changed. So it doesn't matter how many times this bill comes to the floor. It doesn't matter how many times our Republican colleagues feign outrage over non-citizens unlawfully voting without a shred of evidence. It doesn't change the fact that as good as the proponents may make this bill sound or try to make this bill sound, it is nothing other than a solution in search of a problem. Now, I speak both as a senator representing California, but also as a former chief elections officer of California, where I, as the secretaries of state across the country, by the way, worked alongside tireless election clerks and administrators across the political spectrum at the state and local level. And given that experience, I can tell you this: there is no credible evidence of a meaningful number of non-citizens voting in our elections. In 2016, audits showed that non-citizens accounted for 0.0001% of the vote. Even the conservative Cato Institute has said that, quote, non-citizens don't illegally vote in detectable numbers, end quote. And I'm glad Senator Lee mentions the National Voter Registration Act, because as he pointed out, it was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States in terms of its guidance of what states can and should do and what they cannot do. He also didn't mention that the National Voter Registration Act was adopted on an overwhelming bipartisan vote of Congress. But rather than propose legislation based on facts, this bill would respond to the alarming allegations that Republicans themselves have fabricated. It would create more barriers to exercising the right to vote and would restrict ballot access for even more Americans than is currently the case. It would make voting harder for the more than 21 million eligible voters in America who can't easily access their proof of citizenship. I don't know about you, I'm not in the habit of carrying around my birth certificate or even my passport. Not everybody has a passport. Doesn't mean you're not a citizen if you don't carry a passport. And I'm not just talking about Democrats or Republicans, I'm talking about Americans of both political parties. The bill would clearly also disproportionately impact voters and communities of color. In addition, this bill seeks to undermine faith in our elections by injecting fear and uncertainty, particularly in an election cycle at a time when our democracy demands more calm and understanding of the integrity of the process. But Senator Lee and I agree on one thing, believe it or not, and that is voting is a sacred responsibility, and the right to vote in and of itself is fundamentally sacred. So to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, if you're truly worried about the election and our democracy, then ask you this: join me. Join me in passing the Freedom to Vote Act and making sure that all eligible Americans, yes, only United States citizens, can make their voices heard at the ballot box without any unnecessary barriers or obstacles. It's the most American and the most bipartisan thing that we could do. But until then, let's be honest with the American people. So yes, Mr. President, I object.
Mr.
The
President.
objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
I appreciate how the presiding officer always speaks loud enough so that everyone can hear, and the presiding officer also manages the floor with great assertiveness, which I also appreciate. I'm grateful to my friend and colleague, this distinguished senator, my colleague from California, and his thoughtful approach to legislation. There are some things that he said that I feel that I need to address. One of them is a reference to a belief that there is no credible evidence of non-citizens voting, at least no credible evidence of non-citizens voting in any significant numbers. Well, there are studies that go exactly the opposite direction, studies like the one that I cited just moments ago, showing that it is a non-trivial sum, such that if even something at the low end of the percentages cited in that study were correct, that could easily be enough to sway the outcome of some elections. But regardless, what my friend is referring to has to be taken with a grain of salt, considering how things have changed on the ground. The numerator and the denominator of that fraction have changed over the last few years, where we've now got about 30 million non-citizens living in the United States, with about 10 million who have come in who are illegally in the United States now, who entered this country unlawfully and are now living in the United States. That is not a non-trivial sum. When that many people enter the United States that quickly, and when you've now got all 50 states and D.C. that issue driver's licenses to non-citizens, that coupled with the National Voter Registration Act and the way the National Voter Registration Act was interpreted a few years ago by the Supreme Court of the United States, saying that the state officials who processed those federal forms submitted under the NVRA so that people can register to vote in federal elections while applying for their driver's license, that creates a toxic soup in which there's an environment just ripe with opportunities for foreign interference in U.S. elections. You cannot add this many non-citizens, legal or illegal non-citizens to the United States in this short of a period of time, and couple it with that kind of voter registration framework and not anticipate that there will be significant numbers of people who will end up registering to vote. Some perhaps somewhat innocently, perhaps others less innocently, I don't know. But it would be supremely naive, and worse than that, willfully blind to what we all know is going to happen unless we pass this. Now, the House of Representatives passed this bill yesterday, which gets to another point made by my colleagues, saying that we've been down here over and over and over again doing this bill. I'm not sure what he's referring to. The bill hasn't even been around that long, but something material changed yesterday. Yesterday, the House version of the SAVE Act, which is the version that I'm coming to the floor today to propose, the one that I just tried to pass by unanimous consent moments ago before it was met with the objection of the senator from California. That bill was passed yesterday, less than 24 hours ago, by the House of Representatives, with bipartisan support, I would add. Not just Republicans over there, some Democrats who are concerned with very good reason joined with Republicans in order to get this thing passed. So, to say that this is an area in which there's no credible evidence of any need to act is science fiction fantasy. It is contrary to fact, it is contrary to logic, it is contrary to our understanding of human nature, contrary to our understanding of the National Voter Registration Act and how it's been interpreted by the Supreme Court of the United States, and how elections work. As to my colleague's suggestion that this is feigned outrage that's animating this, nothing could be further from the truth. Look, I wish this could be feigned. I wish I had the luxury of this being something that were feigned. Mr. President, this is serious business. We lose something. We lose something as Americans anytime certainly anytime we allow our elections to be vulnerable to interference from forces outside the United States, including foreign nationals, non-U.S. citizens inside this country. When that happens, when the public starts to perceive that others are voting in this, diluting their votes, that has deleterious effects on the effective operation of our Republican form of government that are very difficult to recapture once they're lost. We can't treat this casually. And so, look, I will be back. It's unfortunate that we weren't able to pass this today. Let me restate the point I made earlier. There is not a legitimate reason to oppose this bill. We make it incredibly easy under this bill for any American. If you are an American citizen, you can easily prove your citizenship. And you can do it in the way this bill requires, and you can still vote. It is not hard, it is not expensive, it need not require anyone to spend a dime, a nickel, or even a penny. It just requires you to be an American. There is not a legitimate reason to oppose this bill. There is not a logical reason to oppose this bill, unless, of course, your objective is different, unless, of course, you are just fine with and in fact excited about or reliant upon non-citizens voting. That's alarming. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thousands of families across the United States of America, with the stroke of a pen, not just bringing fairness and justice, but hope and opportunity to men, women, children, long-term residents of the United States who happen to be undocumented, but a child of or a spouse of a United States citizen. Having lived here in the United States for more than 10 years, working, paying taxes, excelling in school, bottom line, building a life. This is home. And as of today, a pathway to no longer live in the shadows, no longer live in fear of deportation, but to be able to be on that pathway for legal protections and potential eventual citizenship, it is an exciting, exciting day for all of us. And I believe just not only in the morally right thing to do for these children and these families, but it is truly in the best interest of the United States of America. So we stand together in applauding President Biden for his actions today, and looking forward to working with him to bring about similar solutions and similar pathways to other undocumented communities in the weeks and months ahead. With that, let me turn it over to the chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Congresswoman from Los Angeles, Nanette Barragán.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the patience and the accommodation. Hello to the witnesses. Apologize for the delay. I was presiding in the Senate. A vote just opened, but I'm back here now as a proud member of this committee for this timely and important hearing. Now, there is one point in which the majority in Trump, the United States, and I fully agree, Mr. Chair. The criminal trial of a former president for attempting to disrupt the peaceful transition of power is a matter of, quote, lasting significance. That was in the ruling. Couldn't agree more. I also agreed with the Chief Justice that the court's focus in deciding the case ought to have been, quote, the enduring consequences upon the balanced power structure of our republic. Unfortunately, for our democracy, it was not. Instead, the court's majority was satisfied with inventing a new form of presidential criminal immunity so sweeping that the court declined to designate a single action that Donald Trump took in the lead up to the January 6th riot at the Capitol as, quote, unofficial. And in doing so, the court undermined a core principle of our government, that the president, as Alexander Hamilton put it, is, quote, amenable to personal punishment, and not a king who is, quote, sacred and inviolable. Where the majority fears that the dissenting justices were, quote, content to leave the preservation of our system of separated powers up to the good faith of prosecutors, end quote, I am far more troubled that the court's right-wing majority that now left that task to the good faith of convicted criminals like Donald Trump. Let's be clear. The court's decision to effectively let Trump off the hook has already caused devastating harm for our country, especially to voters and election workers. Trump has essentially been given a pass for weaponizing the Department of Justice to bully states into drumming up false election fraud charges, for his attempts to pressure Vice President Pence into helping him steal the election, and for inciting a violent mob to storm the Capitol on January 6th. And we're continuing to see the fallout. Texas law enforcement, fueled by Trump's false election fraud claims, has harassed Latino voting rights activists, candidates, and even sitting elected officials. In the state of Florida, law enforcement has targeted individuals who signed a petition for a constitutional amendment to protect reproductive rights. And across the country, there has been a surge in abusive public records requests aimed at election offices. We're even seeing naturalized United States citizens who are eligible voters being stripped from voter rolls without due process. The actors behind these examples clearly feel untouchable. And former President Trump, the leader of the big lie and fake voter fraud movement, has been granted impunity by the very justices he helped install on the court. So that begs the question, what will the next president get away with this newly established immunity? I know I've spoken, I know the hearing's gone long, and I appreciate the patience, but a few quick questions for Ms. McCord. With the limited time that I have left, I want to ask a few simple yes or no questions about hypothetical but not far-fetched scenarios. If a future president were to order the Department of Justice to cease investigating their spouse, their child, or themselves for alleged criminal conduct, would that be an official act?
It would appear that under the court's ruling, yes, that would be immune. Actually, even more than official act as core constitutional powers.
Because the president directs the executive branch. Scenario number 2, if a future president were to direct the armed services to attack the home of a political rival, would that be an official act?
I think that is one of the questions the court leaves open for us. If his own...
The fact that it's not a clear no is the problem, because the president is the commander-in-chief. Like, Mr. Chair, I can go on and on with example after example that should alarm us and the American people. But I will conclude by just acknowledging this. It's particularly auspicious that this committee is meeting today to examine this wildly consequential and wildly unprecedented decision. 235 years to the day since the Supreme Court was established by an act of Congress. So in closing, I'll just echo Justice Sotomayor's powerful words. Every president in our history has governed with the understanding shared by the American people that they could be held accountable for crimes committed while in office. And with that no longer the case, I share her fear for our democracy, and I stand firmly with the spirit of her dissent. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla, and thank you to the witnesses. We appreciate your being here today. The committee meeting stands adjourned.
From North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. Americans should be able to trust our electoral process, but the Biden-Harris administration, it's undermining the system. And this is rightly causing millions of Americans to doubt the integrity of their vote. And that's why my colleague from Utah, Senator Lee, has worked so hard to pass the SAVE Act. It's a common sense bill to make sure only American citizens vote in American elections. Now, this would address one of the most pressing threats to the electoral system. But there's also another serious threat to the integrity of our elections: the use of taxpayer dollars for partisan political activity. During the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration, President Biden signed an executive order directing the head of every federal agency, to submit a plan for their agency to, and I quote, promote voter registration and voter participation. Now, on the surface, this seems like a harmless order simply designed to increase the number of Americans who vote. And I believe, we probably all believe, that is a laudable goal. The problem is that the order also mandates that all federal agencies partner with approved third-party organizations to provide these services on federal agency property and using your taxpayer dollars. So big questions remain. Less than 2 months before a general election, which third-party organizations are approved, who approves them, and what criteria are required? All of this information is conveniently missing from that order. Now, Congress has attempted to provide some and conduct some oversight on this. And citizens have rightly filed the Freedom of Information Act lawsuits. The Biden-Harris administration has released only a tiny fraction of these agency plans. Now, in at least one instance, the administration redacted every single paragraph of an agency plan, leaving only vague headers. I have one of these, Madam President. I have 8 pages of redaction. That's how they responded to what American citizens are entitled to in regards to freedom of information. That's how the Biden-Harris, Kamala Harris administration responded. So it begs the question, what does the Biden-Harris administration have to hide? I'm concerned that this administration is writing their own rules and using taxpayer money to partner with liberal get-out-the-vote organizations. For example, a few months after this order was issued, the Biden-Harris administration hosted a listening session to discuss the implementation of this order. Now, about 50 left-wing organizations attended this meeting, and every representative attending was either registered as a Democrat or donated to Democrats, with the exception of one member of the Green Party. According to notes from a Department of Justice attorney documenting this meeting, their talking points focused on expanding Democrat voter blocs and espousing extreme liberal views. Remember, this is everyone's taxpayer dollars doing this. Now, as a matter of principle, I don't believe that the federal government should be using those taxpayer resources to advance their partisan politics and policies. That's a principle that should be commonly shared across the aisle. But more than that, the prospect of a blanket federal agency mandate to engage in electioneering on the taxpayer's dime, that raises serious ethical and legal concerns. Now, I don't think you can draw any conclusion other than to say that this executive order is another example of the weaponization of federal government. Congress should shut down this ethically and legally dubious scheme to help restore faith in our elections. And that's why I stand here today to propose that the Senate pass the Promoting Free and Fair Elections Act. The bill is simple and straightforward. It would prohibit federal agencies from using your taxpayer dollars to enter agreements with partisan organizations that conduct voter mobilization activities. The Biden-Harris administration's sweeping directive is inherently political and directed primarily at groups expected to vote for one party over another. And when the American people ask for information on it, this is what they get. This order must not be allowed to stand. As in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Rules and Administration be discharged from further consideration of S. 1398 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senior senator from California.
Madam President, I rise today in opposition to a bill introduced by my colleague from North Carolina. And let me start by saying this. The senator from North Carolina says the federal government should not use official taxpayer resources, no taxpayer dollars, to advance partisan politics. I'd be happy to know that I agree 100%. And I'd venture to say that all of my Democratic colleagues agree 100%. But let's also be clear that the executive order referenced isn't that. And my colleagues attempt to attribute some scheme behind informing eligible citizens of their right to vote and facilitating their voter registration and participation is simply without merit. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, when debating the SAVE Act, we are now less than 6 weeks until the November election. And while there may be disagreement on policy with my colleagues, we should certainly agree that it is crucial to make sure that every eligible American can participate in the political process. Again, without any unnecessary barriers or obstacles, and certainly without intimidation. As I referenced a few minutes ago, I once served as California's Secretary of State, the Chief Elections Officer, where I'm proud of the reforms that we implemented, making it easier for eligible citizens to register to vote, stay registered to vote, because that's not easy in some states, and to cast their ballots in the elections. But I want to emphasize, these reforms were put in place for all citizens, regardless of political party, regardless of political leanings. We wanted to make sure that every eligible Californian could exercise their right to vote. And that's what should be our business here today, ensuring that every eligible American can exercise their right to vote. So that's exactly why President Biden first issued this executive order, which builds on decades of what once upon a time was bipartisan efforts to expand voter registration. What could be more patriotic than performing your civic duty? The bipartisan history of Congress in promoting voter participation includes a bipartisan passage of the National Voter Registration Act once upon a time. President Biden issued the executive order to bring the weight of the federal government to help Americans register to vote. And it strikes me as perfectly reasonable that when Americans are already interacting with the government, that we should take that opportunity to securely get more eligible Americans registered to vote and ready to participate in the elections. So the executive order that we're debating here is simply fulfilling the mandate that Congress created with the passage, bipartisan passage, of the National Voter Registration Act. So I couldn't help but notice that in the debate, in the presentation, in the arguments, that there has been a failure to point to any partisan language, either in statute or in the executive order. So I'm disappointed that these efforts continue. What we should be doing is working together to facilitate civic participation and combating misinformation and disinformation surrounding the 2024 election that only risks confusing or discouraging people to participate. So for those and other reasons, Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President.
The junior senator from North Carolina.
Thank you, Madam President. And I really do appreciate my colleagues' comments, especially the part on agreeing 100% with me. You know, it's very easy for my Democrats colleagues to wax poetic about wanting more Americans to want to register to vote. And after all, it could be that the program I'm discussing here is designed only to help his party. You know, especially when I go back to what I referenced earlier about a Department of Justice attorney documenting this meeting, and notice that all the points were focused on expanding Democrat voter blocks. And it was 50 left-wing organizations that attended the meeting, except for that one member of the Green Party. You know, and when we asked for details on this, of course he said it wasn't that, but I do look at the top of this document from the Biden-Harris administration, referred to as the Interim Strategic Plan for the Implementation of Executive Order 14019, access to voting. And this is what the American people get from the Biden-Harris administration. Now, I would hope at the very least that my colleague, while waxing poetic, would agree about this program. Like all federal programs, should not be about oversight and transparency, but that's the case at the present time. And I do want to make one thing perfectly clear. We need as many people as possible to vote. Republicans and the vast majority of Americans support the idea that you need a photo ID to vote. Republicans and the vast majority of Americans support the idea that you should be a U.S. citizen to vote. And Republicans and the vast majority of Americans do not support the use of federal taxpayer funds, your dollars, for partisan political activity. You know, opposing these measures make it clear that my Democrat colleagues simply aren't valuing election integrity. You know, especially when we ask for details, and this is what the Biden-Harris administration shows the American people. in regarding Executive Order 14019, access to voting. Republicans value election integrity, at least you can tell by our efforts here. Folks, we just want it to be easy to vote and hard to cheat. I hope the American people are watching. I yield the floor.
That's all right. Senator Padilla.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Kennedy, I would happily give you 75 cents for that dollar bill in your hands. This is the Budget Committee, so let's make some smart investments here. Look, I do have a couple questions I want to get to, but I do want to follow up on some of the questions, some of the issues that my colleague raised beyond just the supply side of the housing conversation, which is the emphasis of the hearing today. If we are going to go down the road of the impact of significant numbers of migrants that have come to the United States over the years, not just the impact on supply and demand and the cost of housing, the request for more data, but I think if we're going to do so intellectually honestly, we also need to consider and incorporate how existing homeowners' equity in their homes has gone up because of the impact of supply and demand. When home prices are higher, existing homeowners have that wealth in their nest egg known as home ownership. I think that should be recognized and considered as well. If we're going to consider the impact of immigrants in the housing market, let's consider the impact of migrants in the workforce. Because a lot of contractors I've talked to have been working hard, working feverishly, working desperately in recent years to find more and more workers to keep up with the number of construction jobs that are available. So migrants fill those very important workforce spots, without which the cost of construction would be much higher if it was more of a shortage of folks working in construction, and I can go on and on and on. So again, happy to entertain the conversation, happy to work with my colleague to obtain more insightful data, but let's be intellectually honest and comprehensive in our thinking and analysis. That being said, the shortage of affordable housing is not a new issue, as you all, I imagine, would agree. But the magnitude of the crisis that we're facing today certainly impacts nearly every American in urban areas, in rural areas, and everywhere in between, in red states, in blue states, and everywhere in between, while disproportionately impacting low-income families and communities of color. The data is the data. That's why I was proud to introduce last Congress and this Congress my Housing for All Act, which is a bill that calls for a strategic surge in federal funding, investments in existing programs to reduce housing insecurity and increase funding for innovative, locally developed solutions that cities across California and other states have successfully utilized, so proven to work programs developed bottom up. We know that our local and state partners are doing innovative things on the ground to try to solve housing insecurity every single day, but they need the federal government to step up, to do its part, to treat the crisis with the funding and seriousness that it deserves. Speaker Shiraki, how does the lack of federal investment limit the supply of housing and the ability of states and local governments to deal with this crisis?
Thank you, Senator. It's a significant issue. The lack of or the limited amount of federal assistance means that it's just fewer homes, and it exasperates the problem. We need the federal government to be involved in the space. And I understand the budgetary pressures on the federal budget. I understand that. But you can make that argument about budgetary pressures on every single issue, from defense spending to corporate tax cuts to every issue that you face, which is a myriad of issues, and I respect and understand that. But housing is an immediate problem. It is families. As I said earlier in my testimony, it affects everybody. We can make all the policy programs we want to affect outcomes, health care, all kinds of things, et cetera. But if you don't have a home to go home to, a sustainable home, your education outcomes are poorer, your health outcomes are poorer. The federal government has a critical and important role to play, and it must play that role. This is not, I try to emphasize this, this is not a blue state or a red state issue. This is an every state issue. Governors, the National Governors Association met earlier this year. It was a top issue for all 50 governors. We need the federal government to partner. We need the states to play a role in this. We need our local communities, either the county government or our cities and towns, whether it's land use reform.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hate to cut you off. I want to get one more topic in here, and I'll thank you for being so articulate, and I will work with you to communicate your position to your United States senators.
Thank you.
The topic of GSEs came up a little while ago. Government-sponsored enterprises play a central role in the modern mortgage market. By purchasing loans from financial institutions, GSEs such as Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac enable lenders to offer lower interest rates, thereby expanding homeownership opportunities while leveling the playing field for lenders of all sizes. The system was created to stimulate lending in response to the Great Depression. But today we face a different crisis, a lack of housing supply. As you know, construction is highly sensitive to economic conditions with lasting effects. We saw this in California during the 2008 financial crisis and more recently during the pandemic when rates of new housing construction dropped significantly. Now, I know Senator Warner brought up the topic of GSEs in the context of the investor pools. My question is different. When we acknowledge that construction loans are consistently given at higher rates, much higher rates than traditional mortgages, sometimes as high as 14%, that's what led me to secure language in a recent spending bill to study the idea of establishing a secondary market for construction loans to help drive down the cost of construction of new housing to help address the affordability concern. Mr. Williams, I see your head nodding. How would a secondary market help incentivize new construction while also being a stabilizer during economic downturns?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, my organization, Center for Public Enterprise, has also done work on this same topic. And it's not just that construction interest rates have gone up, also construction loan to costs have gone down. So you're no longer able to get a mortgage for 65% of your construction project. It may now come down to 50%. What remains needs to be filled with equity investment, which is also particularly expensive. So one thing that we've explored is whether the GSEs can support construction financing by providing a secondary market for mezzanine investments that can come in at a portion of the total project cost and bring down the total cost of capital in a lot of these projects. And we believe there's hundreds of thousands of stalled multifamily units across the country that are stalled due to these financing constraints. And this is a way that the GSEs could explore addressing that issue.
I look forward to working on this with you. Thank you very much. Thank you,
Senator
Mr.
Van
Chair.
Hollen.